Hello and welcome back to All You Need Notes for Edexcel IGCSE History, and this is the third video in the USA topic from 1918 to 41, and this one's looking at the USA in Depression from 1929 to 33. The first thing to look at then is the Wall Street crash. I'll show you two features of everything in this part of this specification, but it isn't very long, I'm going to warn you. There's only 4 things to look at. The first feature of the Wall Street crash is that share prices dropped. So by 1929, there was $64 billion worth of shares on the Wall Street stock market. People had bought and sold a lot of stocks and shares, and they bought shares from a business. The business got some money, they used that money to increase their profits, and then the person who got the share could then sell it on to another person and get a profit from that. But there happened to be a loss of confidence in the stock market, and so many people sold their shares quickly. They worried that businesses were going to collapse, and they worried that their share would then be worth less than what they bought it with, so they wouldn't make a profit if they sold it on. So they wanted to sell them really, really quickly in order to make sure they didn't lose too much money. And this caused the share prices to drop really, really quickly. And so there was complete panic on Wall Street. On Black Thursday, what we call Black Thursday, prices fell really, really rapidly. People panic sold. They were so scared that they were going to lose money. They sold loads of things. And on that day, shares lost $26 billion. Banks were having to call back loans. They didn't have enough money to give people who were selling their shares, and so they had to call back loans, and businesses suffered because of this. The second feature is that there was deflation. So credit reduced and businesses failed. Overproduction as well from farming meant that prices fell, and businesses just now didn't have enough money. They couldn't pay wages for their workers, so they had to sack workers. And banks failed as well. People had no savings, they couldn't afford food, and Europe cut trade with the US in order to minimise the effect of the Wall Street crash on them. The second thing to look at then is intervention and volunteerism. So this is what President Hoover responded to this crisis with. The first feature of this is that Hoover believed volunteerism would help the US. So he believed that the government should not interfere in the economy at all, and that markets would end up fixing themselves, businesses would get through it. He took a laissez-faire attitude. He didn't believe the government should give out handouts to people or try to help businesses. Businesses would settle themselves out. If some businesses went bust, that was fine. The market would find a way to fix itself eventually. And he emphasised this idea of rugged individualism. People had to help themselves out. They couldn't rely on the government. They had to get their own money if they needed it. The second feature of this is that the government used intervention to help in the Depression. So even though he was heavily for volunteerism, because of the extent to which America was suffering, he did have to use intervention eventually. But this wasn't so much in lots of handouts to businesses and people. It was in a different form. So the Hawley-Smoot tariff came into effect in 1930, and this raised import taxes on foods. So food that was imported from other countries, for example from Europe, that came to America, there was a tax on that by 40%, which meant that the companies who sold them had to raise their prices. So Americans, because these prices were so high and they didn't have much money, they decided to buy food that was cheaper, i.e. food that had been raised and grown in America. So not food from other countries. This meant that farmers in America profited a bit more, and it caused prices to increase, so it helped to combat deflation. Secondly, the 1932 Emergency Relief and Construction Act gave a lot of loans to different business companies to try and promote building. So, for example, the Hoover Dam was built, which was named after President Hoover. And this helped because these companies got loans from the government and they used that to pay for materials for these construction projects and also to pay for people to build them. So it gave people jobs, it helped the economy, and that was a way to try and get out of this depression. It didn't help very much at all, but it did help a few individuals. So on to unemployment, homelessness, and also Hoovervilles. The first feature of this is that people lost their jobs and their savings because industries began to struggle. From 1930 to 33, after the Wall Street crash, 9,000 banks closed. They didn't have enough savings or money to keep going, and because there wasn't any backup, when banks closed, people's savings that they'd put in that bank disappeared, and $2.5 billion in savings was lost. So people had no money in banks anymore. All this money they paid in during their life in order to save up was completely gone. Farming income fell as well to $2 billion in 1932, which is a third of what it had been 3 years previously. And this was combined with the Dust Bowl, storms, and horrifying weather conditions, which had torn apart a lot of farms in America and meant that farmers lost their land. They had to move away to other states. So this meant that farming income just collapsed completely. Combined with this, wages in industry fell by 50% in 1933, and even the Ford factory was having to make workers redundant. So as you can see from this, a lot of people were struggling. They lost their jobs, they lost their money, they lost any backup, and people were set out onto the streets. A second feature of this is that many moved to Hoovervilles. So these are named after President Hoover because he had done so little to help. So a quarter of the workforce were unemployed in 1933. They were sacked, they didn't have a job, and so they didn't get any money. And because they didn't have any money, they couldn't afford rent, and because they couldn't afford rent, they didn't have a house. And because of this, they decided to set up shanty towns, which they called Hoovervilles, in major cities like New York City, Washington, etc., with the help of charities. And a lot of other homeless people decided to come along to stay with them. They were in informal housing, but they needed a place to stay. They set up in parks in these cities in order to try and find somewhere to live because they had really fallen on hard times. The birth rate fell because couples couldn't either, well, they didn't have money to raise a child, or they didn't have the space, they didn't even have a home to raise a child in. And immigrants and black people were the most likely to end up in these Hoovervilles because there was a lot of prejudice against them, and so they were the most likely to lose their jobs. The final thing to look at then is the bonus marches. So what were they? These were First World War veterans who had been promised bonuses. So these were people who had fought in the First World War, and the American government had promised them, because they'd been away during the war and they hadn't been able to work and they didn't get wages for that, the government promised $625 worth of money as a bonus, which they were going to give to these veterans in 1945. But these veterans had now become unemployed. They'd lost all their savings in the Depression, and they wanted that bonus straight away. They were really struggling, and they thought, what's the point of waiting another 12 or so years? We want it right now. And so they tried to get the government to give them that money right then in order to feed their families and make sure they weren't struggling and dying. And so they decided to march to Washington. So this was the second feature. So in 1932, 20,000 of them marched to Washington in order to try to pressure Hoover and the government to give them money. But Congress rejected their proposal, and they weren't allowed this bonus. But they didn't give up. They decided to set up camp in Washington, right outside where Hoover was living, and in order to try and pressure him and convince him to change his mind. However, Hoover decided to call the US Army. He got them to come over to where they'd set up camp and to get rid of them. And the US Army used tear gas on these bonus marches. 100 people were injured, some even died. And this was absolutely awful for Hoover's reputation. Newspapers were absolutely scathing about him. He had set up the police against American war veterans, the heroes who had allowed Europe to be free. And this was not a very good look for a president at all. So Hoover really, really struggled and suffered because of what he'd done here. And that is it for this video on the USA in Depression. from the USA 1918 to 41 part of the IGCSE history course. Thank you very much for watching, and if you find this helpful, please do like and subscribe and give a comment as well, just so I know how you found it. Thank you and goodbye.